clearly.
Okay. Okay. So, if you need anything throughout the interview, just let me know, or if you want some more water, or to go to the bathroom or anything, just, that's fine.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So thanks for coming and for agreeing to do the podcast. What made you say yes to this?
Well, it's a topic I think that really speaks to something that's important to talk about always. And it's also a professional area of interest of mine. Has been in grad school, and really all my life has been something that I've been thinking about. So there aren't a lot of spaces where you can just walk in and have a conversation about this without, being at risk for making other people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's an invitation to maybe talk about this on purpose, I'll take it.
You said this, and it referring to race and racism.
Yes, right.
It's an important subject to talk about.
Absolutely.
How come?
I think our history and the way that human beings have interacted with each other for a very, very long time always has a racial component or an ethnic or a group component to it. And I think we're not doing a very good job with a lot of things when it comes to race and how our societies are structured, how we speak to each other and talk to each other. So, I think it's important so that we can basically improve the lives of everyone, I think, if we can figure out how to do this better.
Nice. Thank you. So I made a mistake already.
What's that?
I forgot to ask you who you are.
Oh, okay.
Who are you?
So my name's Dr. Rebecca Hubbard. Should I say more, or?
If you want to.
No, I'll leave it at that for
Okay,
now.
Sure.
I think more will definitely come out
Right.
with your questions.
Okay. And how do you think of yourself? How do you identify?
So it's important to me that I identify, and likely will identify for the rest of my life, as a biracial woman, specifically an Afro-German woman. But I also experience myself as a Black woman in a lot of contexts. And when it comes to a lot of topics, my Black identity comes to the forefront much more easily.
What is, can you tell me about the term Afro-German?
Yes, so my father is African American. He's from Houston, Texas. And my mother is German, born and raised. And I was raised in Germany for most of my life until I moved to the US for undergrad, so for college. And I think what feels so right about the term Afro-German is, one, it feels difficult for me to persistently deny my mother as part of my identity or my mother's side of the family. And so if I call myself a Black woman without having some space to acknowledge that there are also other very important parts to me, it just feels incomplete. And so that's where the German part is very important. I also find it important that my mother is white but was not raised in the US, because there seem to be a lot of cultural differences, particularly when it comes to the topic of race, between the way that my mother learned about, talked about, deals with issues of race within the context of Germany, and the way that things are here. So the term Afro-German captures that aspect too, with the German part. And then it's important to me that I'm also not the German that you might think of in a free association task, or like if someone says German, most people do not think of people of African descent. And so that's where the Afro part, the African heritage via Texas, becomes very important to me as well.
Is the Texas piece something that's important to you as well?
So I never lived there. I've only ever visited Texas. So I don't have a strong personal relationship with the state or the things there, but they did influence my father quite a bit, and so kind of, the aspects of his life growing up in Texas that influenced him, that feels important to me.
What do your parents think about that term, or identification, Afro-German?
They both love it.
They love it? Yeah, why do you think they love it so much?
Well, for the same reason that they wanted my name to sound good in both languages, German and English. They did think about this a little bit, and I don't think either of them would ever want me to deny either side of my heritage. So I think my father would have some questions if I started not using the Afro part or not, talking about that aspect of my heritage. And likewise, I think my mother would have some questions about, like, well, what about your German side? If I left that out of my identity.
How do you say your name in German?
Rebecca.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you ever refer to yourself in that way in your day-to-day life? Or introduce yourself in that way?
In the German pronunciation?
Yeah.
No.
How is it to say it here?
A little weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it feels similar to when people say, "Oh, say something in German," and then I just say a random sentence.
Oh, okay.
Although I know you can understand my name, so. But yeah, I think the language piece is also something that feels very important to me, and connects me deeply with Germany, is the fact that I speak it fluently. I still dream in German, which I really enjoy. Yeah.
Are all your dreams in German?
No, not all of them. So you never know what you're gonna get when I start dreaming. But yeah, and because we spoke both languages while I was growing up, and it even got to the point where I was at times translating for my parents.
For each other? Yeah.
I don't think that German will ever be lost for me as a language. I make a conscious effort to also read in German to keep it up to date.
What was that like translating for your parents?
I mean, I think as a kid I remember it being kind of fun. It gave me this sense of oh, look at what I can do. It gave me a sense of competence. And it was also frustrating that the two people who, I saw as adults, had difficulty communicating, or where miscommunications there led to arguments. I'm like, no, but that's not what that means. And then, we could avoid some conflict at times. So that it was probably an inappropriate amount of responsibility, honestly. But it also, it had its limits. It's not like they called me in to translate things that were extremely important. It was more casual. But when you're out to dinner and some kind of tension arises, or something where they disagree on that's based in language, then.
So did they speak more English or German to each other when you weren't there? Or when you were there? So
I think if we were all together, I have a younger brother who's 4 years younger than me. So when it was the four of us, probably mostly English. But around my grandparents, they didn't speak fluent English. So then it would be German. And then my father's German actually developed quite well. So we were able to communicate in both languages. Sometimes he would miss words or need to replace it with the English word, but for the most part, we could switch back and forth.
And growing up, then, did you come visit your dad's family, or had you been to the States before you came here for college?
Yes, there was. So there was between 0 and 2, we lived in Hurlong, which is in Nevada. But I don't remember that. And then, but my grandparents on my dad's side, and those aunts and uncles, everybody remembers me from them. And then there was a visit to California. How old was I then? Maybe like 12 or 13 or so, which again is still not Texas. So the first time I went to Texas was actually in college while it was over here.
What was that like?
Yeah, Texas was different than, so I went to college in North Carolina, so the southern aspects of the state felt familiar to me. But I think the things that feel most memorable about Texas was the time that I spent there with my grandparents. So, and we didn't really go far or do much. We stayed fairly close to the house. But it was the first time that I was spending time with them without my father or my mother there. So that was
it's
really
a special time.
Yeah. I still remember it fondly.
And did they know about what your life was like in Germany?
My father's side of the family doesn't really communicate that much, and now my grandmother has passed away, but even, that wasn't like there wasn't an open line of communication where it was regular between my father and that side of the family. And from my understanding, that had nothing to do with conflict or, some kind of this deliberate disengagement, but it was just the phone. And then at that time in Germany, calling to the U.S. was also expensive.
Oh, sure.
So then that played a role as well.
As you were describing your identity, you said that in some contexts you identify as Afro-German, in some as biracial, and some as a black woman. What differentiates how you feel about who you are by context?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So sometimes, like, when I feel like I can fully be myself, I'm Afro-German. And then it's almost like I can freely talk about all of the aspects of my identity. I can openly criticize American culture and everybody knows why. I can, I feel the most free when I can feel myself operating in that identity. Biracial, similar, but maybe not quite as open or like as expansive. And then the reasons why I feel pulled towards my identity as a black woman often have to do with what I have deemed, whether I'm right about that or not, important for the moment, important for my connection with who I'm talking to, or what is important about the people around me. So it's actually in service of others often.
Can you describe the situation where you felt that way?
So most of the time in the U.S., I think when people ask you like, oh, where are you from or what's going on, what they really want to know is what category can you put you in? Are you safe? Can I talk to you about my political beliefs? Can I, that they draw all kinds of conclusions. And I've, since college, have had a lot of experiences where, depending on what other people thought I was, their interactions with me changed quite significantly, even if nothing else has happened. And so, I think if I'm forced to choose, which I feel like I'm forced to choose in the American context quite often, I will choose a black identity. If I don't have to choose, if I can just be myself, I'll be Afro-German.
When are you forced to choose?
When being white means I'm infiltrating, because that's the other option. People don't, either they see me as white or they think that.
When you say when being white means you're infiltrating, say, like a black space?
For example, yes. Or when being white, or like when not being black would mean that I'm not trustworthy.
to other black people.
To other black people. Or
do you find that you were put in your?
I just want to add one more. Or in the presence of white people, I also want to make it clear that I'm not comfortable with them saying white racist things. Because I do not want to expose myself to that.
And how do you signal to people in that kind of setting?
That's
hey, by the way.
So, I mean, I think it's like a mutual feeling out process that I've heard other people who appear racially ambiguous go through a lot, so I know I'm not alone with this.
You're not.
But it really depends. So for example, I'm part of a specific type of yoga practice that is Kemetic Yoga, which is ancient Egyptian. And it is the most important part of the philosophical underpinnings of that practice is that it is rooted in Africa. And so, you know, when I enter those spaces, I make it clear that I am not resistant to that idea whatsoever, that I'm in full support of examining philosophies and ideas that come from the African continent, that is important to me, that I find that valuable. So by expressing that, sure, there are people who, you know, still think that I'm white when I say that, but that's a signal.
That's a signal that you're black.
Yes.
Or part black.
Or that I'm at least one of the white people that gets it. At minimum.
Do you find that people of a certain background or race are more likely to sort of feel you out for who you are?
Yeah, I mean, how people see me like that, I've given up on trying to predict that, to be honest with you. So, you know, I think people who have not had exposure to a lot of mixed race people tend to really have an intense need to figure out, quote unquote, what I am. And so in the US, that is mostly black people.
Black folks are more likely to
really
try to figure you out.
And I think, you know, in other contexts, perhaps the figuring out process is more silent on their part or takes longer or...
Can you feel that when it's happening?
I think so. And it feels uncomfortable. Yeah.
Do you talk about this stuff with your brother?
Yes. He's in the army, he's in the military, where this topic comes up in lots of different ways. And he's similar to me, presents as very light, not you know, also racially ambiguous. And so he's been in several situations where white people have used the N-word in his presence, and he's had to express that he does not want to tolerate that. And because of my brother's personality, he does that quite forcefully. But generally, after that, things go fairly well. He's had a few instances where people still want to have a conversation or discussion, or then maybe are curious about his identity. But that's an example of a signal that he uses, right? That's not okay. And so then
very direct.
Right, and so then people start asking about his identity.
Have you found other allies or other Afro-Germans that you spend time with here in the States?
Not in Chicago.
Not in Chicago.
But when you run into one, it's the best.
What's it like?
Well, the ability to have a conversation in German is always a treat. That always feels really good. But I've noticed that when I meet white people who are German, which has happened to me here in Chicago, sometimes I run into their racist ideas. So, running into someone who is black and German is really, it's a real treat. And there's an immediate connection. This actually happened to me not too long ago when I was visiting New York. I met a woman who is much older too. Like she's like in her late 50s and grew up in southern Germany, and is also mixed, so one black parent and one white parent. And to meet someone who's so much older than me is also not something that happens to me often. Most of the Afro-Germans that I meet are my age or younger. So the age was really valuable in that moment.
Is there a sense of like a family type feeling, like you with other Afro-Germans?
Yeah, there's this sense that we've been through something similar, or that we understand the dilemma of at the same time feeling very connected to a culture because it is home, and being rejected within that culture at the same time, and that in some ways still being unique from the way that Black people describe their experience here. Because German culture is different from American culture.
How do you assess whether someone is safe to sort of let your guard down around when it comes to, you said being able to be myself?
Yeah, that's intuition.
It's intuition.
It's like a gut feeling I have, and I've learned over time to trust it a little bit more, because when I can't rationalize why I don't feel safe, the reason reveals itself later.
It comes.
And you know, I think while I'm a little less careful, in the sense that I'm a little less apologetic about how different my identity might be, I'm also a little more careful about who I'm willing to like have a conversation like this with.
You won't expose yourself to just anyone.
No. No, not when, and you know, now this is one of those moments where I'm aware that this is a conversation that will be public, but I don't have to be there for other people's reactions. So that helps, because I know that people can have reactions to what I'm saying, and I accept that, and I'm okay with that, but I still want to make choices about when I engage with it and when I don't.
Do you find yourself more often in spaces that are all one race, mixed race, or majority one race, or?
Yeah, most of my environments are, well, since college even, predominantly Black. So I went to a historically Black college for undergrad in North Carolina. Obviously everyone there was pretty much Black. And then I went to graduate school in Virginia, where this was Virginia Commonwealth University, so the majority of the school was white, but Richmond is a majority minority city, so most of the people who live in the city are Black. And my friendship circle there was mostly Black, with a couple of cohort members in my graduate program who I felt safe with. Yeah, it really didn't start expanding more in the US until like internship year or after that even.
Do you need more evidence or more more experience with white folks to feel safer with them?
Probably, more time.
More time.
It would help to see them in more than one context too.
Why is that?
Because I mean, part of the mistrust is that they're filtering something because they think they can say something to me that I don't actually agree with, or that actually hurts me. And so, yeah, being able to see them with other people. And that's not just about race, that's in general about how someone conducts themselves, like their character. So yeah, I think maybe more time.
More time.
And I think again, like it depends on what kind of space I encounter this person. So for example, the Kemetic Yoga group that I was talking about earlier, there are definitely white people who are part of that group. It's not a lot of them, but there are, there was one white woman who was part of my cohort there, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She, definitely, I did feel safe with her. The same way I felt safe with everyone else who was part of that cohort.
A white person who's in that kind of space already has some credibility built up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Although it is not, it's not 100% automatic, right? Like just because someone decides to be in that space does not mean that I automatically trust them. It's just like, it's a good start. Because, there are people who put themselves in spaces like that for the wrong reasons.
Such as, what would a wrong reason be?
That it's mostly an external validation seeking for why they believe certain things, as opposed to a genuine belief in, like with the Kemetic Yoga group, it would be the importance of African history and African philosophy.
That's the external validation?
So if the validation or the please accept me is more important than
I see. The actual content.
Exactly.
I see.
Then that might not be quite the best reason.
Someone who somehow needs to be accepted by black folks
Right.
for whatever reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I haven't spent that much time trying to figure out why that's the case for some people.
Why they need that acceptance.
Right. But it feels to me like that's a part of an identity development that professionally I'm okay sitting with. Personally, I would choose not to.
So you mentioned professionally, although you haven't shared about your profession.
That's true. So I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice. And what I was mentioning earlier was that this topic of race is also a professional interest. So it was a research topic for me during my graduate training, and continues to be something that I write about and think about professionally.
What are you working on? Are you writing something actively now?
So there's a blog that I'm writing that includes some of these Kemetic principles that I'm talking about, the African philosophy, and how they can potentially enhance our well-being.
Can you share one? Can you share one of those?
Sure. So it's an easy one. So for example, well, some people might know this as Hermeticism, or like the Hermetic laws, the Kabbalion. Those are all the names that it's known under, but we have the oldest text of that is African. And so one of the principles in that text is the law of correspondence. As above, so below is a colloquial phrase that a lot of people may be familiar with. And that's an expression of how we are, basically how we are all connected, that all things take place on varying levels of matter, but also that, the same patterns and principles regulate all living things. And so this sense of connectedness, I think, is something that, we've also seen through research, more modern research,
Right.
that's a principle that once people can believe that and embody it, improves our well-being.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
How does race play out in the office with your clients?
Yeah,
I know
so,
that's a broad question, maybe an example or two.
right, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that a large majority of the clients who seek to work with me are people of color. And so I actually, when you were talking about do I need more time to feel, safe with white people, even in my practice, I don't have that much experience with white people. So for one, I do think the response that I get, the people who are seeking help, are often people who want to work with a black person. And so that's also interesting because, in my Psychology Today profile or in other, just to the public, I have my picture up. I don't know what people think when they see that, but I make it a point as a signal, we talked about earlier, to talk about how important I think identity is. I say that I work with African American clients and people of color, so that's, I think, the signal that people use to say that, I think she might be black. If they don't, immediately come to that conclusion based on the picture.
Do you have white clients as well?
I do.
Yeah.
And the topic still comes up at times, so it's not that, which is one of the reasons why, what we were saying earlier about how important it is to talk about these things. I think it takes over so much of our social space that of course it comes up for most people, people in general, right? Not just people of color.
Do your clients ask you about your identity?
I have been asked before.
How do you answer?
Well, I throw the question back first.
Like any good therapist. Why are you asking?
Exactly. And then, the answers to that vary. But I'm generally comfortable disclosing that I have one black parent and one white parent. And, some of the things that we're talking about here today are also things that I have shared with some clients in the past. And this comes up sometimes when clients have talked about feeling hurt by a past white therapist, or they and a past white therapist have come to the conclusion that they should see a person of color or a black woman specifically for therapy. So then maybe they want to confirm or make sure. Or
in that case, it makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
So you talked about how good it feels to meet other Afro-Germans.
Yeah.
What other kinds of experiences have you had that have been healing for you around race and racism?
So I was thinking about this in preparation for the podcast. Growing up in Berlin specifically was, I think, in and of itself healing for this question, because I wasn't alone. There are a lot of, when it comes to mixed race people, there are a lot of black white people in Berlin specifically, partly because of the American occupation of that space, and African immigrants, and as we know, most immigrants gravitate to urban contexts because of the increase of opportunity there. And so that I was just, the basketball team that I played on when I was growing up was incredibly diverse.
Wow.
We had several people who were mixed race but with different lines of heritage than me. We had people from lots of different European backgrounds, Turkish, all kinds, really. And so I think that being my starting point was a true benefit. And I think probably protected me in some ways from some of the things that would have made it more difficult for me to feel comfortable being who I am.
Were you in Berlin when the wall came down?
Yes, I was young, but I
you
was
were young. Well, you don't have to date yourself. Do you remember what that was like?
I remember that we went there, like to the wall, to where it was coming down, and I remember that my parents had made a bet of 50 Deutschmark about whether it would fall or not. I can't remember who won. I'll say that. But yeah, it was an important and memorable time. But I was really young.
You were quite young.
Yeah.
Do you think that it shaped any sort of your identity, of the way you thought about yourself, or the course of your development?
The wall falling in particular?
The wall falling and the changes that were happening that led to that.
Yeah, so I mean the American occupation is why I was born, right? I mean my father was stationed in Berlin, and that is where he met my mother. So it's like this is this is the reason I'm here. And I think the difference in sectors was so very apparent to us. So going to the east of the city when I was, a teenager was very different than spending time in the west where I grew up. We actually avoided it when we could. It was also deemed as to be racially a little less safe for me and other friends that I had who were people of color or mixed race. So that felt significant. But I don't remember a time when I wasn't able to go to the east, but my mother does, right? So, but she still makes a joke nowadays that when she has to go to the east, she still needs a map. Like everywhere else in the city, she's fine.
She knows where to go. Yeah, but for years of her life, she couldn't go there.
That's right. Yeah, or made a decision not to go afterwards.
So you brought an object with you?
I did.
Oh, let's see.
Here we go.
Thank you. Wow. Looks like a shell. Oh, what is this?
So it's a beetle, a carved beetle. Kepra is the Kemetic or ancient Egyptian term for it, and the beetle stands for transformation. So my trip to Egypt, where I got certified in Kemetic Yoga and this practice that I was sharing earlier, was truly transformative for me. Like I think settled into my identity, and this was in 2017, so this wasn't that long ago. It kind of put all of the pieces together for me that still felt like loose ends when it came to like feeling comfortable with calling myself someone of African heritage. And so, yeah, that trip changed my life, definitely.
Well, this is beautiful. There's a lot of symbols on here. Are these hieroglyphs?
Yes, so those are hieroglyphs. I'm not able to read it, not all of them, but I have taken a few classes in reading hieroglyphs, so I'm working on it.
What would you be willing to share about that transformation and what happened?
Sure. So I was always fascinated with Egyptian culture, even as a young girl. Like I remember in 5th or 6th grade, we took a field trip to see mummies and the bust of Nefertiti, and it was like my favorite. I still remember it and know that I was pretty young at the time. Any documentary I would see or like a book I could read that involved Egyptian culture I was definitely in, and felt drawn to it. And then, fast forward to my life, maybe after graduate school, I started my yoga practice quite seriously, in a sense that I was practicing maybe like 5 or 6 times a week. But at that time had no idea that there was such a thing as like yoga that originated in Africa. And I always felt like a very welcome guest at any, and I was trying all kinds of yoga. I mean, if it had yoga in the title, I was gonna sign up and I was gonna give it a try. And there are lots of different styles and orientations, and some practices are a little bit older than others, some are more westernized, some are, more ancient. But when I practiced Kemetic Yoga for the first time, it distinctly felt different. And it may have something to do with the instructor, it may have something to do with where I was in my, own reflections about myself at the time, but something about there being knowledge that our African ancestors knew something about this, knew something about movement and the benefits of it, and specifically how to move, and the shapes and the angles that are good for our body. That realization changed everything, because I felt like this fits. It brings together all of the things that really resonate with my identity.
Your ancestors.
My ancestors, that's right.
And what happened on that trip?
So it was a yoga teacher training, really. Only that our history and philosophy lessons then took place by also touring temples, taking a cruise down the Nile and stopping at different temples. We landed in Cairo and then flew down to Aswan and took a 3-day Nile cruise up the river with that powerful body of water. And all of these ancient hieroglyphs and temples, and having taken one class in how to read hieroglyphs before, seeing what our ancestors decided to document and what they deliberately wrote down, not for fun, but because they wanted us to know. When I tell people about the trip, like, I cried every day I was there. And so then, in between, in different hotels and at different venues, we would learn about this practice, and we would learn how the practice connects to what we saw in the temples. And so slowly but surely, these loose ends felt tied up, and the people who I met on the trip, like I mentioned, the white woman who I felt very comfortable with, but also everyone else on that trip seemed to say things to me that made me feel seen and understood. And so I think I'm still digesting some of what happened there, but yeah, I took some water from the Nile with me, and a little bit of sand from in front of the Sphinx, and it feels important that's part of my lineage in some ways.
Rebecca, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Is there any last words you'd like to share?
No, I'm very grateful to you for doing this.
Thank you.
And thank you for allowing me the space to talk about myself. Felt good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Is that an hour?
That was 42 minutes.
Okay.